So we left off discussing antecedent manipulations in the example of Johnny, who demonstrated aggression towards others by screaming and hitting others around him when preparing to transition from classes. What are ways that we could manipulate the antecedent to intervene for this behavior? And a few things that we talked about in class were great. What David and Leah both contributed were excellent ideas that we could absolutely try. And some other ones that we may want to try would be a first then board, the timers that Dr. Persh discussed, and some of those visual cues to facilitate that transition. So I want to go a little bit further into the discussion about reinforcement. Any outcome that strengthens the chance of a desired behavioral response is a reinforcement. And although that says desired, it doesn't have to be a desired behavioral response that we are strengthening through reinforcement. As we know, certain reinforcements like attention and escape from situations or from demands can absolutely reinforce negative or challenging behaviors that we don't necessarily want to occur. So reinforcements are individualized. We want to consider what works for children. So when we're trying to get kids to work with us, some kids will work for a sticker, others want candy or choice of a game or activity at the end of your session. And behaviors can be shaped by the consequence or the reinforcement that they're receiving for acting in that way. So that's important to consider as we are developing our interventions and working with others. And I also wanted to provide the disclaimer that we no longer use punishment to manipulate behaviors. So we really only talk about positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement in the way that you're taking away something, but never punishment. There's a few types of reinforcement. There's continuous reinforcement, which is where you're reinforcing the behavior each and every single time that it occurs. So there's some benefits and disadvantages to this. First, you'll learn a lot quicker if every time you engage in that behavior, you're being reinforced for it. However, there are some disadvantages. It's not very likely that someone has the availability and the time to reinforce a behavior every single time it occurs. So there's very good chances that you won't be there to reinforce it each time, and it can be difficult to coordinate with so many different people, being the teacher, the recess aide, the bus driver, the parents, the siblings that babysit them, whatever it may be. It can be difficult to get everybody on the same page to truly be able to provide that continuous reinforcement for a behavior. There's also partial reinforcement, so that's where you're reinforcing the responses only sometimes. And there's a few different ways that you can do this partial reinforcement, which we'll talk about in a few slides. The benefits to this is that the learned behaviors are slower to extinguish. So although you'll learn quicker with the continuous reinforcement, you'll learn more deeply, and it'll be more clear to you, and you'll keep that memory of those learned behaviors longer with partial reinforcement. However, there are some disadvantages, and that's that it can take a lot longer. So a few different types of schedules of reinforcement. So the first one is a fixed ratio. That is a reinforcement after a specified number of responses. So this means that after you do something a specific amount of times, you'll be reinforced. So we have the example for an OT. If the kiddo they're working with writes 3 sentences, they get to pick the game. So that's a fixed ratio. There's also fixed interval. So this is where the reinforcement for performing behaviors at least once in a specified time period. So there are still a specific time period that you're earning that reinforcement for, but it's very specific. So if you do your OT homework and bring it in each week, you can earn a field trip at the end of the month. So you have to bring it in once per week to earn it. A variable ratio is when the reinforcement is provided after an average number of responses. So the precise number of responses may vary. So when we think of this one specific example that comes to mind is gambling or cold calling. So the more you do it, the more likely you are to eventually win some money when you're gambling, or the more calls you make, the more likely you are to have someone buy your product that you're trying to sell. So An example in OT would be that you have taught a child to engage in 5 different active range of motion exercises. So you have the child complete the exercises at the beginning of the session, and you reinforce every 2 reps on average. So this means that you would be reinforcing the child after maybe the first one, the second one, but then you skip the third and you reinforce after the 4th, and then the 6th, and then the 9th rep. So it's not every 2 or something that's fixed, it's an average of every 2 reps. A variable interval is a reinforcement for producing the response after an average time interval. So this time you're looking at the time interval when you're looking at the average. An example of this would be an OT is working in a group setting where each child is writing their responses to a prompt, and the OT awards each student after an average interval of 2 minutes working. So let's say you're working with a child on handwriting for 10 minutes. You might reinforce them after 1 minute, 3 minutes, 7 minutes, and then 8 and 9 minutes. So that's still, you're reinforcing them 5 times within 10 minutes, so that's still an average of 2 minutes, but they're not fixed so that every 2 minutes you receive that. The variable ratio is starred because that is the most effective schedule of reinforcement. So if you think back to the gambling, which is, can be pretty addictive, that's a good way to help remember that, because the more you do it, the more likely you are to earn something. An example of a fixed ratio that we use a lot in occupational therapy is a token economy system. So I have to earn 5 stars doing whatever it may be, and then I can earn I think that says Cheeto. So you can earn a Cheeto if you complete, let's say, 5 sentences. Differential reinforcement is the implementation of reinforcing appropriate responses. So this is when we are working with children to manipulate the consequence. So instead of focusing on the antecedent manipulation, this time we're figuring out what's reinforcing the behavior, what is the consequence, and how can we modify that. So for the example, when Leela's teacher was working with other students and Leela would take her friends' phones, books, etc. without asking for permission first, what are some things that we could do to help her? So some of the things that we could do would be to change the way the teacher responds to Leela. So originally, she would go over to Leela and she would give her that attention. She would talk to her about how it's not right to take her friends' items, and she would talk to her about appropriate responses in the future. So one way you could try changing it would be to, ignore the problem. If it's something that you don't need to give back to the friend right away, if it's something you do need to take away, just go pick up the phone, either give it back or take it away completely then, so that, and don't say anything to Leela, so you're not providing her with that attention. And eventually, if you do this enough, Leela would learn that this behavior is no longer providing her with attention. So that could eventually go extinct. That behavior would eventually go through extinction. Another way that you could work to address this problem is by reinforcing the appropriate behaviors. So while you're ignoring her when she steals, you could make sure you give her special attention when you hear her asking a friend for if she can borrow something, to kind of teach those appropriate behaviors. So that's kind of the gist for the ABC analysis and the antecedent manipulation and differential reinforcement, but we also can use self-management when working with difficult behaviors. So self-management is where learners are taught to discriminate between what's appropriate and inappropriate. So this is typically used for older kids and kids with better communication skills or with better cognitive skills to understand these self-taught concepts. So this would allow the child the chance to sit down and figure out exactly what is appropriate and what's inappropriate. And then they talk with someone to figure out how they can monitor and record their own behaviors. So how often are they engaging in the appropriate versus inappropriate behaviors? And then they're also taught to reward themselves when they behave appropriately. So self-management is often used with employment purposes as well, so learning how to do job tasks. And it's proven to be very effective in both situations. DIR, floor time. This is a kind of developmental play-based intervention, so it aims to help children reach those developmental milestones that are crucial for emotional and behavioral growth. So some things that they will work on is the self-regulation, intimacy or communication between different people. Oftentimes, this is where you're on the ground playing with the child, you're having that two-way communication, you're playing with emotion. So, as you're playing, you might express certain emotional thinking or certain emotional ideas to kind of model that for the child. And as we've talked quite a bit about now, play-based behavioral interventions are child-led. They are not adult-directed. It allows for the adult to get on the child's level and really start playing at their developmental age level in their natural environment and address certain activities. You can address ADLs, but when you see certain behaviors occur, that's when you'll try to address them in these play-based scenarios, not where you are trying to specifically cause the behavior. So, for example, you may be working with a child on communicating effectively. So you might, when a child wants to play with you and you can tell what they're trying to tell you, you may wait for them to specifically communicate that with you or bring you over to it, whatever goal you're working on. Some other evidence-based behavioral approaches are structured ABA, discrete trial training, early intensive behavioral interventions, and this has the highest level of research supporting it. And we're not going to go into too much detail on these, but I do want to let you know that each of them uses operant conditioning principles. So that's where we learn to associate a certain stimulus with the behavior. And the behavior is shaped by what comes after it. So whether they're reinforced or not would be the correct situation because we no longer use punishment. But you'll remember this from Pavlov's dogs. Basic operant learning has a cue, so something you say or do that is the antecedent to the behavioral response that you're looking for, the response, and then the reinforcement is provided immediately. It's easy to use, and it's also easily generalized as long as everyone's on the same page, which is good. So I'm going to show you this real quick clip, and this is just kind of a fun example.
Well, thank you. How thoughtful. Would you like a chocolate?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
So you see Penny picking up his plate, and
sorry, Sheldon, I almost sat in your
Sheldon is
spot.
rewarding her with
Did
chocolate.
you? I didn't know this. Have a chocolate.
And here she's being
Thank you.
rewarded for moving out of his seat.
You're here a lot now.
Oh, am I talking too much? I'm sorry. Zip.
Thank you. Chocolate?
Yes, please.
So this is kind of a fun example of him using that operant conditioning. If I can get out of this. As you can tell, I am planning a trip to visit my sister in Germany. Here we go. Okay. So other OT approaches to addressing behavior are some that we've already talked about. The AIRS sensory integration, using social stories to address one behavior at a time, and then also visual supports for some of those more challenging behaviors like transitions. And those all have evidence-based information supporting their ability to address behaviors. Additionally, there's positive behavioral supports, which is a blend of ABA principles using environmental considerations, and that's very individualized. And then there's also pivotal response training, and that's where you find a fun way to engage the child in something, in a specific behavior that you're looking for. So the example that's provided here is where a therapist is working on communication. They'll put the child on the child may go to the swing, and you may push them one time, and then you may hold the swing and wait for them to give the desired response before you give them another push. For positive behavioral supports, there's 5 steps, which I have listed here for you. It's really encompassing team building and then also goal setting as a team. And then we want to consider why we even need to address behaviors. We might be wondering why psychology or someone else isn't being brought in to address some of these difficult behaviors, but we have to consider that oftentimes behaviors need to be addressed as a team, first and foremost. But additionally, challenging behaviors can interfere with successful therapy and activities of daily living. If you're having a child who is demonstrating aggression by hitting and screaming when they're transitioning, it's going to be really hard to get them through their day successfully at school. So that's definitely a big role of OT to help facilitate. And then this NBC OT prep question I'm actually going to include on your quiz, so you get a little sneak peek. This will be another bonus question, but just to provide you the chance to answer it without knowing exactly what the answer is right away. And then this is already happening. So your quiz will be due on Wednesday at 8 a.m. So thank you. Did that not work at all?